I woke up that morning knowing my life was about to change forever. But I had no idea just how dramatically everything would unfold in that courtroom. My hands were trembling as I buttoned my navy blazer, staring at my reflection in the mirror of my downtown Seattle apartment. The woman looking back at me seemed older than her 42 years. With new lines etched around her eyes from months of sleepless nights and tears, I thought I'd already cried out. But today wasn't about weakness. Today was about fighting for everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed, everything that monster tried to take from me. The rain hammered against the windows, typical Pacific Northwest weather that matched my stormy mood perfectly. I could hear the distant sound of traffic on Pike Street, the city waking up to just another Wednesday, while I prepared for the battle of my lifetime. My attorney, Margaret Chen, had called me the night before with a warning that still made my stomach churn. The judge assigned to our case was William Harrington, and according to her research, he and my soon-to-be ex-husband Robert had been fraternity brothers at the University of Washington back in the 80s. The coincidence felt too convenient, too perfectly orchestrated. But Margaret assured me we had options, that we could file for a change of judge if needed. I told her no. I wanted to see exactly how far Robert would go, how deep his betrayal truly ran. The courthouse loomed ahead as my Uber pulled up, its gray stone facade imposing and cold under the overcast sky. I stepped out onto the wet pavement, my heels clicking against the concrete as I made my way through the security checkpoint. The metallic beep of the detector, the sterile fluorescent lighting, the echo of footsteps in marble hallways. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Margaret met me outside courtroom 5B, her expression professionally neutral, but I could see the concern in her dark eyes. She squeezed my shoulder gently and whispered that no matter what happened in there, we had prepared for this. I nodded, swallowing hard against the lump forming in my throat. When I walked into that courtroom and saw Robert sitting at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, something inside me hardened like steel. He looked so confident, so self-assured in his tailored Tom Ford suit that I knew cost more than most people's monthly rent. His lawyer, Preston Whitmore, was exactly what you'd expect. Slicked back hair, expensive watch, that particular brand of arrogance that comes from winning too many cases against people who couldn't afford to fight back. Robert didn't even glance my way as I took my seat, which somehow hurt more than if he'd glared at me with hatred. The indifference was worse. After 17 years of marriage, I'd become invisible to him, nothing more than an obstacle standing between him and what he believed he deserved. If you're finding this story compelling so far, I'd really appreciate it if you could click that subscribe button below. We're working toward reaching 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to building this community where we share real stories about real struggles. It just takes one click on that red subscribe button to help us reach that goal together. Judge Harrington entered the courtroom with the kind of authority that comes from decades on the bench, his black robe flowing behind him as he took his seat at the elevated platform. He was probably in his mid-60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that immediately found Robert's face and softened almost imperceptibly. My stomach dropped. Margaret had been right to worry. The judge made some preliminary remarks about the proceedings, his voice professionally detached, as he outlined what we were here to determine today. The division of marital assets accumulated during a 17-year marriage between myself, Catherine Elizabeth Morrison, and Robert James Morrison. It all sounded so clinical, so devoid of the emotional devastation that those 17 years represented. The judge didn't mention the nights I stayed up until 3 a.m. working on business proposals while Robert slept soundly, believing I was just doing some light bookkeeping for his construction company. He didn't know about the investment strategies I'd quietly implemented, the real estate opportunities I'd identified and seized, the financial acumen I'd honed through countless hours of self-education, because Robert always dismissed my ideas as cute attempts to contribute. No, to Judge Harrington, this was just another divorce case, another wealthy couple fighting over assets, nothing special or noteworthy about the human cost of what was being decided here today. Preston Whitmore stood up with theatrical flair, adjusting his cufflinks before addressing the court. His opening statement was a masterclass in manipulation and revisionist history. According to him, Robert Morrison was a self-made man who had built a construction empire from the ground up through sheer determination, hard work, and business savvy. He painted a picture of a devoted husband who had provided generously for his wife, giving her a comfortable lifestyle and asking for nothing in return except her support. And what had Catherine Morrison contributed to this success story? According to Whitmore's narrative, absolutely nothing of substance. She'd been a housewife who occasionally helped with administrative tasks, nothing more than a secretary with a fancy title and access to the company checkbook. The lies were so brazen, so utterly divorced from reality, that I felt my face flush with anger. Margaret placed a steady hand on my forearm, a silent reminder to stay composed, to let them dig their own grave. Whitmore continued, his voice dripping with condescension as he described me as someone who had enjoyed the fruits of Robert's labor without understanding the actual work that went into building and maintaining a successful business. He claimed I'd spent frivolously, traveled extravagantly, and now that the marriage was ending, I was attempting to claim credit for achievements that were solely Robert's. The audacity of it all took my breath away. Then came Robert's testimony, and that's when things went from insulting to absolutely devastating. He took the stand with that same confident swagger, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. What followed was the most elaborate fiction I'd ever heard. A complete rewriting of our shared history that painted him as the victim and me as the opportunistic villain. He talked about how he'd started his construction company with nothing but a truck and a dream, conveniently forgetting to mention the $50,000 I'd inherited from my grandmother that we used as seed money. He described the long hours he worked, the deals he negotiated, the relationships he built, all while failing to acknowledge that I'd been right there beside him, often doing the actual financial analysis that made those deals profitable. When Whitmore asked him specifically about my contributions to the business, Robert actually laughed. Not a chuckle, not a polite dismissal, but a full derisive laugh that echoed through the courtroom. I watched Judge Harrington's face, hoping to see some recognition of how inappropriate this was, but instead, I saw him suppress a smile, as if Robert had just made some clever joke that only old friends would appreciate. That's when I knew how deeply the deck was stacked against me, how thoroughly Robert had planned this betrayal. Robert's voice took on a bitter edge as he continued, and this is the moment that's burned into my memory like a brand. He actually pointed his finger directly at me across the courtroom, his face twisted with contempt, and said words that I'll never forget as long as I live. This Bruxa Murcha, he called me, using a Portuguese term he'd picked up from a business associate, not contributing with anything for our success. That withered witch contributed nothing to our success. The translator provided the English version for the court record, but everyone in that room understood the venom behind those words. He called me dried up, useless, a parasitic presence in his life who'd been lucky enough to attach myself to a successful man and ride his coattails to prosperity. Your support really does make a difference in helping this channel grow. If you're enjoying hearing about how I fought back against this injustice, please take just a moment to click subscribe. We're building something special here, a place where people can share their truths and support each other through difficult times. Help us reach that 1,000 subscriber milestone by hitting that subscribe button now. The courtroom fell silent after Robert's outburst, but it wasn't the shocked silence of people horrified by his cruelty. It was more like an uncomfortable pause, the kind you experience when someone says something socially awkward at a dinner party, and everyone's trying to decide whether to laugh or change the subject. Judge Harrington actually cleared his throat and made some comment about keeping testimony focused on facts rather than emotions, but his tone was gentle, almost apologetic, as if he was reluctantly chastising an old friend, rather than properly admonishing inappropriate behavior from a witness. Whitmore seized on Robert's momentum, painting an even more detailed picture of me as someone who'd been given every opportunity and advantage, but lacked the intelligence or drive to truly contribute anything meaningful. He presented bank statements showing large withdrawals, which he characterized as my frivolous spending, conveniently ignoring that those withdrawals were actually investments in properties I'd identified and that had since tripled in value. He showed credit card statements for what he called luxury items. A $15,000 purchase at a jewelry store that was actually an estate sale acquisition of vintage pieces I'd resold for $45,000. A trip to New York that he framed as a shopping spree, but was actually a real estate investment seminar, where I'd learned the strategies that would eventually make us millions. Every piece of evidence was twisted, every fact presented in the most damaging light possible. And through it all, Judge Harrington nodded along, his expression one of sympathy directed entirely toward Robert. When Whitmore finished his presentation, asking the court to award Robert the full value of the marital assets given that he was solely responsible for their accumulation, the judge was already nodding before the lawyer even sat down. I felt Margaret tense beside me, her pen gripping tighter in her hand as she scribbled notes for our defense. But we both knew how this looked, how thoroughly Robert had stacked the deck in his favor. The morning session ended for a brief recess, and Margaret pulled me into a conference room down the hall. Her usual composure had cracked slightly, worry lines creasing her forehead as she paced back and forth. She told me honestly that this was worse than she'd anticipated, that the judge's bias was more obvious than she'd hoped, and that we needed to decide whether to push for a mistrial based on judicial misconduct. I asked her what our chances were of succeeding with that approach, and her pause told me everything I needed to know. Harrington had been careful, staying just within the bounds of plausible deniability, making it nearly impossible to prove actual bias versus simple agreement with the plaintiff's case. I sat there in that sterile conference room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and felt 17 years of my life being erased, rewritten, invalidated. All those nights I'd stayed up creating financial models while Robert entertained clients at expensive restaurants. All those weekends I'd spent researching market trends and investment opportunities, while he played golf with those same fraternity brothers who were now helping him destroy me. All those moments of quiet contribution that he'd dismissed as cute hobbies or wifely duties, never acknowledging that my financial strategies were the actual engine driving our wealth accumulation. It was all being reduced to nothing, characterized as the delusional fantasies of a woman who couldn't accept that she'd simply been lucky to marry well. I want to take just a moment to thank those of you who've already subscribed to the channel. Your support means the world, and it's what keeps these stories coming. If you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a perfect time to click that button and join our growing community. We're so close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and each one of you helps us reach that goal. Just one click on the subscribe button, and you're part of this journey with us. When we returned to the courtroom after lunch, it was our turn to present our case, and Margaret came out swinging. She started by systematically dismantling Robert's testimony, pointing out inconsistencies and conveniently omitted facts. She presented documentation that I'd been listed as a co-founder and CFO of Morrison Construction from the very beginning, not just a secretary as Whitmore had implied. She showed the corporate filings, the tax returns, the official documents that proved I held a legitimate executive position in the company. But Judge Harrington waved this away as mere paperwork, suggesting that husbands often gave their wives honorary titles without those titles reflecting actual contribution or authority. Margaret then moved to the financial records, and this is where our real strategy began to emerge. She presented a detailed forensic accounting analysis conducted by one of the top financial investigators in the Pacific Northwest, a woman named Dr. Sarah Lindstrom, who specialized in uncovering hidden assets and tracing money flows in complex divorce cases. Dr. Lindstrom took the stand and began walking through her findings, and I watched Robert's confident expression begin to falter. She explained how she'd traced every major financial decision made by Morrison Construction over the past 17 years, and what she'd discovered was striking. Every single acquisition that had proven profitable, every real estate investment that had appreciated significantly, every market timing decision that had paid off, they all traced back to recommendations and analyses I'd provided. Dr. Lindstrom showed emails, internal memos, and financial models all bearing my electronic signature and timestamp, proving that I'd been the architect of the investment strategy that had actually built the Morrison fortune.
Robert had been good at the construction business itself, at managing crews and bringing in contracts.
But the real wealth accumulation had come from smart investment of those profits, and that had been entirely my domain. Whitmore objected repeatedly, trying to prevent this testimony from being admitted, arguing that it was speculative and didn't prove actual contribution, only participation. But Margaret was prepared with case law and precedent, and even Judge Harrington, biased as he was, couldn't find legal grounds to exclude properly documented financial evidence. Dr. Lindstrom continued, and her testimony grew more damaging to Robert's case with each passing minute. She revealed that the current net worth of Morrison Construction and its associated real estate holdings was approximately $43 million, and that by her professional estimation, my investment strategies had been responsible for generating at least $32 million of that total. The courtroom atmosphere shifted noticeably. The clerk who'd been half asleep during Robert's testimony was now sitting up straight, fully engaged. Even Judge Harrington's friendly demeanor toward Robert had cooled slightly, though I could see him struggling to maintain his bias in the face of such overwhelming evidence. Margaret pressed her advantage, calling me to the stand to tell my side of the story in my own words. I took that oath, placed my hand on the same Bible Robert had touched, and swore to tell the truth. And unlike my lying ex-husband, I actually intended to keep that promise. I started from the beginning, explaining how I'd met Robert 20 years ago when I was working as a financial analyst for a mid-sized investment firm in Seattle. I'd been good at my job, really good, with a particular talent for seeing patterns in market data that others missed. Robert had come to the firm seeking advice on how to invest the profits from his small but growing construction business, and I'd been assigned to his account. We'd fallen in love over spreadsheets and market projections, our relationship built on what I'd thought was mutual respect for each other's professional abilities. He'd proposed after 3 years of dating, and I'd said yes without hesitation, believing I'd found a true partner. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you're finding value in this story. We share real experiences from real people, and your subscription helps us continue creating this content. We're working toward our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and you can be part of reaching that milestone just by clicking the subscribe button below. It really does make a huge difference. When we got married, I'd made what I now recognized as a critical mistake. I'd trusted Robert completely. We'd pooled all our resources, created joint accounts, built the business together with my grandmother's inheritance as seed capital. I'd transitioned from being his financial advisor to being his wife and business partner, taking on the role of CFO while he focused on operations. In those early years, we'd been a genuine team. I'd handled the numbers, strategy, and investments while he managed the crews, met with clients, and oversaw actual construction projects. It had worked beautifully, our different skill sets complementing each other perfectly. But somewhere around year 10 of our marriage, things began to change. Robert started taking credit for financial decisions I'd made, presenting my investment strategies to potential investors and partners as if they were his own brilliant ideas. At first, I'd brushed it off as harmless ego or perhaps a strategic choice to present a unified front to the business world. But it escalated. He began excluding me from important meetings, telling clients and partners that I was just handling bookkeeping rather than acknowledging my role as the architect of our investment strategy. When I confronted him about it, he dismissed my concerns, saying I was being oversensitive and that he was actually protecting me from the stress of high-level business negotiations. The real betrayal had started about 3 years ago when Robert began having an affair with Jennifer Caldwell, a 28-year-old marketing consultant we'd hired to rebrand the company. I'd suspected something was wrong for months before I'd found concrete evidence. Late nights at the office, suspicious charges on our credit card, a general emotional distance that grew wider with each passing day. When I'd finally confronted him with proof of the affair, he hadn't even tried to deny it. Instead, he'd told me that Jennifer made him feel alive again, that she appreciated his success in ways I never had, that she understood the pressures of being a successful businessman. The irony of that statement, given that his success was largely due to my financial expertise, had not been lost on me. I'd filed for divorce the next day, refusing to stay in a marriage where I was neither valued nor respected. That's when Robert had transformed from a distant, unfaithful husband into a vindictive enemy determined to destroy me. He'd immediately moved Jennifer into what had been our family home, a beautiful waterfront property in Bellevue that I'd identified as an investment opportunity 7 years earlier and that had since appreciated from $1.2 million to over $4 million in value. He'd locked me out of the business accounts, claiming he was protecting company assets. And he'd begun the process of rewriting history, telling anyone who would listen that I'd been nothing more than a trophy wife who'd gotten lucky. As I sat on that witness stand recounting these details, I could see Judge Harrington's expression harden. Not against Robert, as any fair-minded persons would, but against me. It was clear he viewed my testimony as the bitter complaints of a scorned woman rather than the legitimate grievances of a wronged business partner. Whitmore's cross-examination was brutal, attacking every aspect of my testimony and character. He suggested I was delusional, that I'd convinced myself I was more important to the business than I actually was. He implied I was motivated by jealousy over Jennifer, trying to punish Robert for moving on. He even suggested that my financial contributions, if they existed at all, were nothing more than lucky guesses that Robert had been kind enough to indulge. Margaret objected repeatedly, but Judge Harrington overruled her most of the time, allowing Whitmore to continue his character assassination largely unchecked. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt completely eviscerated, every aspect of my professional competence and personal integrity called into question. We broke for the day, and Margaret told me honestly that despite our strong evidence, she was worried about how tomorrow would go. The judge's bias was so apparent that she feared he'd find some legal justification to award Robert the majority of the assets regardless of what the evidence actually showed. If this story is resonating with you, please take a second to subscribe to the channel. We're building a community here of people who believe in standing up for what's right, and your subscription helps us grow and reach more people. Just click that subscribe button and help us hit our goal of 1,000 subscribers. It's quick, it's free, and it makes a real difference. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my apartment staring at the ceiling, rain pattering against the windows, my mind racing through everything that had happened in that courtroom, all the evidence we'd presented, all the documentation proving my contributions, all the expert testimony from Dr. Lindstrom. None of it seemed to matter in the face of Judge Harrington's determination to favor his old fraternity brother. I thought about just accepting whatever unfair settlement they offered, saving myself the continued humiliation of having my life and work dismissed. But then I thought about all the other women who'd been in this position, who'd contributed everything to building something with a partner, only to have that partner rewrite history when things fell apart. And I got angry. Not the hot, explosive anger that burns out quickly, but the cold, calculated anger that sharpens your mind and strengthens your resolve. I got up, made coffee at 3 a.m, and started going through all my personal files. I'd kept meticulous records over the years, not because I'd anticipated needing them for something like this, but because that's just who I am as a person. Every major financial decision, every investment recommendation, every strategic analysis, I had documentation of all of it. But more importantly, I had something else. Something I'd discovered quite by accident about 6 months ago that I'd been saving for the right moment. And I realized that tomorrow, in that courtroom, would be exactly the right moment. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse with a USB drive in my purse and a plan that Margaret didn't know about yet. She'd done everything she could within the conventional bounds of legal strategy. But this was going to require something more. When Judge Harrington called the court to order and asked if there were any additional witnesses or evidence to present before closing arguments, Margaret looked at me questioningly. I nodded, and she told the judge that yes, the defense would like to enter additional evidence into the record. Whitmore objected immediately, claiming we'd already had our chance and were just trying to drag out proceedings. But Judge Harrington, following proper procedure despite his bias, allowed the evidence to be submitted for his review. Margaret connected my USB drive to the court's presentation system, and what appeared on the screen was a series of email exchanges that I'd accidentally discovered when helping Robert with some computer issues months before our separation. He'd asked me to recover some supposedly lost files from his old email account, and in the process, I'd stumbled across a folder he thought he'd deleted. What I'd found in that folder was evidence of systematic fraud that went back years. Robert had been skimming money from the business, hiding income from our joint tax returns, and creating shell companies to shelter assets from what he'd apparently been planning for quite some time. Divorce proceedings where he'd claim poverty and avoid having to split our wealth fairly. The first few emails appeared on screen, and I watched Robert's face drain of color. These were exchanges between him and a shady accountant named Marcus Webb, discussing strategies for hiding income and creating false expense reports. Margaret, seeing the content for the first time, immediately understood what I'd brought to court. Her eyes widened, and she began asking me to walk the court through what we were looking at. I explained in calm, measured tones how I'd discovered these emails, when they'd been written, and what they revealed about Robert's systematic attempt to defraud both the IRS and me. Judge Harrington leaned forward, his earlier friendly demeanor toward Robert completely evaporated. Whitmore was on his feet objecting, claiming the evidence was obtained improperly, that it violated attorney-client privilege, that it was inadmissible under various legal theories. But Margaret shut down each objection with precise legal citations. The emails had been on a joint computer system, accessed with legitimate credentials, and discovered accidentally during routine maintenance. There was no expectation of privacy, no illegal search, nothing that would render them inadmissible. The judge had no choice but to allow the evidence to remain in the record. But I wasn't done, because what I'd found in that email folder was even more damaging than simple tax fraud. There were communications between Robert and Judge William Harrington himself, dating back nearly a year, where they'd discussed this divorce case before it had even been filed. I watched the blood drain from the judge's face as his own words appeared on screen. Emails where he'd promised Robert he'd make sure the case ended up in his courtroom, where he'd coached him on what to say and what not to say in his testimony, where he'd literally conspired to rig these proceedings in Robert's favor. Take a moment to subscribe if you're enjoying this story of fighting back against corruption. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these important real-life experiences, and we're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers. Click that subscribe button now and be part of this community that values truth and justice. The courtroom exploded into chaos. The clerk's mouth hung open in shock. Margaret looked like someone had handed her a winning lottery ticket. Whitmore was frantically whispering to Robert, whose face had gone from pale to red as the full implications of what had just been revealed sank in. And Judge Harrington sat frozen on his bench, a man watching his entire career implode in real time. But I wasn't finished speaking. I looked directly at Judge Harrington and said 5 words that I'd been waiting to deliver for months. 5 words that carried the weight of everything I'd endured, everything I'd built, and everything they'd tried to take from me. Check the offshore accounts, Your Honor. Those 5 words hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Because what those emails also revealed was that Robert hadn't just been hiding money domestically. He'd been working with Marcus Webb to move millions of dollars into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Money that he'd claimed in his financial disclosure was tied up in ongoing projects, or lost to bad investments. I'd traced every transfer, documented every fraudulent statement, compiled every piece of evidence needed to prove that Robert Morrison had committed serious federal crimes in his attempt to cheat me out of what I'd rightfully earned. Judge Harrington's hands were literally shaking as he called for an immediate recess. Margaret and I were ushered into a conference room where, within 15 minutes, 3 different lawyers appeared, representing Judge Harrington, the Washington State Bar Association, and somehow, impossibly fast, a federal prosecutor who'd apparently been waiting for evidence exactly like this in an ongoing investigation into Marcus Webb's financial crimes. It turned out that Robert and his accountant had been on the FBI's radar for months as part of a larger investigation into tax fraud and money laundering. What I'd discovered and documented was exactly what they needed to move forward with charges. The rest of that day was a blur of interviews, depositions, and legal maneuvering. Judge Harrington recused himself from the case immediately, facing not just the end of his judicial career but likely criminal charges for corruption and conspiracy. Robert was taken into federal custody right there in the courthouse, his bail set impossibly high, given the evidence of hidden offshore accounts and flight risk. Whitmore withdrew from the case entirely, probably trying to get ahead of the ethics charges that would inevitably come from his participation in what was clearly a fraudulent proceeding. And I sat in that conference room with Margaret, both of us stunned by how quickly everything had unraveled for the men who'd thought they had rigged the system perfectly in their favor. A new judge was assigned to our case within a week, Judge Maria Santos, who had a reputation for being scrupulously fair and absolutely intolerant of any kind of legal shenanigans. The proceedings started over from scratch, but this time, there was no question about the outcome. With Robert facing federal charges and unable to argue that his hidden millions didn't exist, the division of assets was straightforward. Judge Santos looked at all the evidence Dr. Lindstrom had presented, reviewed my documentation of financial contributions, and made a ruling that gave me 65% of all marital assets based on my disproportionate contribution to wealth accumulation. That worked out to roughly $28 million, plus the Bellevue house that I'd identified as an investment in the first place, plus full ownership of several properties that were solely in my name, but that Robert had tried to claim as joint assets. Jennifer Caldwell moved out of my house within 24 hours of the ruling, and I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd broken up with Robert the moment his legal troubles became public knowledge. Apparently, his success was only attractive when it was real, not when it was revealed to be built partially on fraud and hidden money. Robert ended up pleading guilty to multiple counts of tax fraud and 1 count of money laundering, receiving a sentence of 7 years in federal prison. Judge Harrington fared even worse. He was disbarred, stripped of his pension, and ultimately pleaded guilty to corruption charges that carried a 4-year prison sentence. The scandal rocked the Washington state legal community, leading to reforms in how judges are assigned to cases and new disclosure requirements about potential conflicts of interest. Marcus Webb, the accountant who'd helped Robert hide his money, turned state's evidence and received a reduced sentence in exchange for testifying against his other clients who'd been using similar schemes. The whole house of cards came tumbling down, all because they'd underestimated the withered witch they thought they could easily defeat. If you've made it this far in the story, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We're sharing real stories about real people fighting back against injustice, and your subscription helps us reach more people who need to hear these experiences. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and you can help us get there just by clicking that subscribe button right now. It's quick, it's free, and it really helps us grow this community. In the months following the trial, I had a lot of time to reflect on what had happened and what it all meant. The money was significant, of course. Having financial security and knowing I'd been fairly compensated for my contributions was important. But more valuable than any dollar amount was the validation, the public acknowledgement that I had been the driving force behind our financial success all along. Every article written about the case, every legal analysis of Judge Harrington's corruption, every business journal piece about the Morrison construction scandal, they all correctly identified me as the financial genius who'd built the empire while Robert took credit, and Judge Harrington tried to help him steal it. I started getting calls from other women in similar situations, wives and partners who'd contributed significantly to business success, but found themselves written out of the story when relationships ended. I began consulting with their attorneys, showing them the kinds of documentation to look for, the patterns of financial manipulation to investigate, the ways men like Robert try to hide assets and rewrite history. Margaret and I actually started a small side practice specializing in complex divorce cases, where one party was attempting to minimize or eliminate the other's contributions. We helped dozens of women over the next few years recover what they'd rightfully earned, and every single case felt like another small victory against the system that had tried to crush me. The Bellevue house became my sanctuary. I renovated it completely, erasing every trace of Robert and the life we'd shared there, transforming it into a space that reflected who I actually was, rather than who I'd been trying to be as Mrs. Morrison. I kept the stunning water views but changed everything else. New furniture, new artwork, new energy throughout the space. I turned one of the bedrooms into an office where I managed my investments and worked on the consulting cases, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound, reminding me every day of how far I'd come from that morning when I'd walked into Judge Harrington's courtroom expecting to be destroyed. About a year after everything was finalized, I received a letter from Robert. It had been forwarded through Margaret's office, sent from the federal correctional institution where he was serving his sentence. I debated for a long time whether to even open it, whether anything he had to say could possibly matter at this point. Eventually, curiosity won out, and I read what he'd written. It was, to my surprise, an actual apology. Not the kind of non-apology where someone says they're sorry you felt hurt, but a genuine acknowledgement of what he'd done wrong. He admitted that he'd known all along how crucial my financial expertise had been to our success, that he'd deliberately taken credit for my work because his ego couldn't handle not being the sole genius behind the Morrison empire. He wrote that prison had given him a lot of time to think about the choices he'd made and the person he'd become. He acknowledged that calling me a withered witch in open court had been cruel and completely unjustified, that his anger at me for refusing to tolerate his affair had driven him to say and do things he now deeply regretted. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He wrote explicitly that he didn't deserve it and wasn't asking for it, but he wanted me to know that he finally understood exactly how much I'd contributed and how badly he'd wronged me. I read the letter twice, felt a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't quite name, and then filed it away in a drawer I rarely opened. His remorse was his to deal with, not my responsibility to absolve. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already. These stories of resilience and fighting back against injustice are what this channel is all about, and your subscription helps us continue creating this content. We're building toward our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription matters. Just click that subscribe button and join our growing community of people who believe in standing up for what's right. Jennifer Caldwell tried to reach out to me as well, though her attempted contact was far less sincere than Robert's letter. She sent me a Facebook message about 6 months after the trial concluded, trying to explain that she hadn't known Robert was married when they first started their relationship, that he'd told her I was just a business partner, that she'd been deceived just as much as I had been. I didn't respond. Whatever her initial ignorance might have been, she'd certainly known the truth by the time she moved into my house, and her choices after that point were her own to live with. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to California and was working in real estate, probably using some of the market analysis skills she'd picked up from being around our business. I wished her neither well nor ill. She simply ceased to be relevant to my life. The years since the trial have been transformative in ways I never could have anticipated. I built a new life that was entirely my own, free from the shadow of Robert's ego and the constant battle to be recognized for my contributions. I diversified my investment portfolio, moving beyond real estate into technology startups and sustainable energy companies, areas that fascinated me and aligned with my values in ways the construction industry never had. Some investments succeeded spectacularly, others failed completely, but they were all mine. My decisions, my successes, my failures, my growth. The freedom of not having to justify every choice or fight for credit on every success was intoxicating. I also rediscovered parts of myself that had gotten lost during those 17 years with Robert. I'd always loved painting, but had stopped sometime in year 5 of our marriage when Robert made some dismissive comment about it being a waste of time that could be spent on something productive. I took classes at a local art studio, discovered I actually had some talent, and began creating pieces that now hang in my home and occasionally in small gallery showings. I traveled extensively, visiting places I'd always wanted to see, but that Robert had no interest in. 3 weeks in Peru, hiking through the Andes. A month in Japan, studying traditional crafts. A summer working with a sustainable agriculture cooperative in Costa Rica. Every experience added layers to who I was becoming, filling in the outline of a person who'd been compressed for too long into someone else's idea of who she should be. Dating again was complicated. I went through a phase where I swore off relationships entirely, convinced that vulnerability led inevitably to betrayal, and that I was better off alone. Margaret gently challenged that perspective, pointing out that Robert's failures didn't define all men or all relationships, and that closing myself off completely meant letting him win in a different way. She was right, though it took me a while to accept it. I dated casually for a couple of years. Nothing serious, just enjoying male company without the pressure of building toward something permanent. Some of the men I met were lovely, others weren't, but none of them were Robert. And gradually I came to understand that the hypervigilance I felt around potential partners was trauma, not wisdom. Eventually, I met David Chen at a sustainable technology conference in Portland. He was a software engineer developing AI solutions for renewable energy grid management, and we ended up sitting next to each other at a panel discussion about investment trends in clean technology. We started talking during the coffee break, exchanged business cards, and stayed in touch afterward. What I appreciated most about David was that he never tried to diminish my accomplishments or expertise. When I explained complex financial strategies, he listened and engaged intellectually, rather than trying to prove he knew more. When he talked about his work, he genuinely wanted my perspective on the business applications. We built a friendship first, then a relationship, taking things slowly and deliberately, rather than rushing toward some predetermined outcome. Your support means everything to this channel. If this story has moved you or taught you something valuable, please subscribe so we can continue sharing these real experiences. We're so close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and you can help us reach it just by clicking that red subscribe button below. Join our community of people who believe in resilience, justice, and the power of standing up for yourself. 3 years after the trial, on a clear spring day with Mount Rainier visible in all its glory against a blue sky, David and I got married in a small ceremony at my Bellevue home. Just close friends and family, nothing elaborate or showy, a celebration of partnership rather than a performance for others. Margaret was there, of course, along with Dr. Lindstrom and several of the women whose cases we'd worked on together. My sister gave a toast about how proud she was that I'd fought back and won. And David's daughter from his first marriage read a poem about new beginnings that made everyone cry. It was perfect. Intimate, genuine, joyful. Everything my first wedding hadn't been once you stripped away the expensive trappings and looked at the hollow core underneath. David and I merged our lives but kept our finances separate. An arrangement that made both of us more comfortable given our respective histories with complicated divorces. We created a shared household account for joint expenses, but maintained independent control over our individual assets and investments. It wasn't a lack of trust, but rather a mutual understanding that financial autonomy was important to both of us, that the security of knowing we were together by choice, rather than financial entanglement, made the relationship stronger. We consulted each other on major decisions, celebrated each other's successes, and supported each other through setbacks. But we never let money become the measure of our worth or the weapon in our conflicts. Looking back now, 5 years after that confrontation in Judge Harrington's courtroom, I can see how profoundly that experience changed me. Not just in obvious ways like financial independence and professional validation, though those mattered enormously, but more fundamentally in how I understood my own value and my willingness to fight for recognition of that value. For too many years, I'd accepted Robert's framing of our relationship and our business partnership, allowing him to diminish my contributions because I'd bought into some internalized belief that supporting him was more important than claiming credit for myself. The trial forced me to confront that pattern and break it, to stand up in open court and say definitively that I had built something extraordinary, and I would not allow it to be stolen from me. The phrase "withered witch" that Robert had hurled at me as an insult became something I reclaimed with pride. Margaret actually had a graphic designer create a logo with those words intertwined with a phoenix rising from flames, and she gave me a framed print as a gift. It hangs in my office now, a reminder that the things meant to destroy us can become symbols of our strength if we refuse to accept the labels others try to impose. I even started a blog called The Withered Witch Chronicles, where I wrote about financial independence, divorce recovery, and rebuilding identity after betrayal. It gained a modest following, mostly women in similar situations who needed to hear that survival was possible, that thriving was achievable, that the end of a relationship, even a long, painful one, could be the beginning of something better. The Morrison Construction Company was eventually sold off in pieces to satisfy Robert's legal debts and tax obligations. The name no longer exists. The empire we built together dismantled and distributed among various buyers. There was something bittersweet about watching that happen, seeing something I'd helped create destroyed by the greed and corruption of the man who'd tried to claim it all for himself. But there was also liberation in it, a definitive ending that allowed me to move forward without constantly being reminded of that chapter of my life. The skills I'd developed, the expertise I'd honed, the reputation I'd rebuilt, those all remained and formed the foundation for everything that came after. If you're still watching, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. We're building a community here of people who've faced injustice and found ways to fight back. And your subscription helps us share more of these stories. We're working toward our goal of 1,000 subscribers, so please click that subscribe button and be part of what we're creating together. It really does make a difference, and I'm grateful for every single person who's chosen to join us on this journey. The legal reforms that came out of the Morrison-Harrington scandal have had lasting impacts on how family law cases are handled in Washington state. New protocols require disclosure of any prior relationship between judges and parties in divorce proceedings, with automatic recusal if certain thresholds of familiarity are met. There are stricter penalties for judicial misconduct and more robust oversight mechanisms to catch corruption before it affects case outcomes. Several law schools now use our case as a teaching example in legal ethics courses, examining what went wrong and how the system ultimately corrected itself, albeit imperfectly, and only after significant damage had been done. I've been invited to speak at a few of these classes, sharing the personal side of what it feels like to be on the receiving end of judicial corruption and systemic bias. Those speaking engagements are always emotional for me. Standing in front of a room full of future lawyers, many of them young women, and telling them about walking into that courtroom and being called a withered witch who contributed nothing. It brings back all the humiliation and rage I felt in that moment. But then I get to tell them about the 5 words that changed everything, about the evidence I'd carefully preserved, about the system eventually working even when individual actors within it were corrupt. And I see the fire in their eyes, the determination to be the kind of lawyers who fight for justice rather than enable injustice. And I feel like maybe something positive came from all the pain. I've thought a lot about why I kept such meticulous records over the years, why I documented every financial decision and saved every piece of evidence. At the time, it was just who I was. Organized, thorough, detail-oriented. But looking back, I wonder if some part of me always knew I might need to prove my worth. That the casual dismissiveness Robert showed toward my contributions might one day escalate into complete denial of them. Maybe I was preparing for a battle I didn't consciously know was coming, building an arsenal of truth to deploy when the lies became too blatant to ignore. Or maybe I just got incredibly lucky that my natural tendency toward documentation happened to be exactly what I needed when the crisis hit. Either way, the lesson I share with women in similar situations is always the same. Document everything. Every contribution you make, every idea you generate, every decision you influence, keep records of it all. Not because you expect to need them, not because you're planning for divorce or conflict, but because your work deserves to be recorded and recognized regardless of what the future holds. In healthy partnerships, that documentation becomes a shared history you can look back on together with pride. In dysfunctional partnerships that end in conflict, it becomes your defense against revisionist history and your proof of value when others try to erase you from the story. The therapy I went through during and after the divorce was crucial to my healing, though I resisted it initially. I've never been someone who found it easy to be vulnerable with strangers, to admit weakness or ask for help. But Margaret insisted I needed professional support to process the trauma of what I was experiencing, and she was right. My therapist, Dr. Rachel Kumar, helped me understand that my value as a person wasn't dependent on Robert's acknowledgement of it, that his attempts to diminish me said everything about his insecurities and nothing about my actual worth. She helped me work through the complex grief of losing not just a marriage, but the entire narrative I'd built around that marriage, the story I'd told myself about who we were and what we'd created together. One of the most painful realizations I came to in therapy was that I'd known for years that Robert didn't truly respect me, but I'd convinced myself it didn't matter as long as the partnership functioned. I'd accepted the crumbs of occasional acknowledgement while he took the feast of public credit, telling myself that I knew the truth, and that was enough. Dr. Kumar challenged that accommodation, asking me why I'd been willing to settle for so little, what it said about my own sense of worth that I'd allowed myself to be diminished over and over again. Those sessions were brutal, forcing me to confront not just Robert's betrayal, but my own complicity in accepting treatment that I deserved better than. Growth is uncomfortable, and that period of my life was deeply uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with courtrooms or judges. Consider subscribing if this story has resonated with you. We're creating a space where people can share their experiences of overcoming injustice and rebuilding their lives, and your subscription helps us reach more people who need these messages. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and you can help us reach that goal just by clicking the subscribe button below. Thank you for being part of this community. The financial recovery was actually the easiest part of rebuilding my life, which sounds strange given that the trial was primarily about money. But once Judge Santos made her ruling and the assets were properly divided, that part was done. Complicated to execute, certainly, with lawyers and accountants handling the technical transfer of properties and accounts, but fundamentally straightforward. The emotional recovery took much longer, the rebuilding of my sense of self after having it systematically attacked and denied. That work continues even now, though it gets easier with time and distance from the events that shattered my old understanding of who I was and what my life meant. I think about Robert sometimes, though less and less as the years pass. I wonder if prison really changed him, or if the letter he sent was just another manipulation, an attempt to ease his own guilt rather than genuine remorse. I wonder if he truly understands even now what he tried to take from me. Not just money, though that mattered, but my history, my contribution, my fundamental right to be recognized for what I'd built. I wonder if Jennifer ever thinks about her role in everything, if she has regrets, or if she's convinced herself that she was just a victim of circumstances. But mostly, I try not to wonder. Dwelling on what they think or feel or understand gives them space in my mind that they no longer deserve to occupy. Instead, I focus on what I've built in the aftermath. The consulting work with Margaret has helped dozens of women navigate similar situations, armed with knowledge of what to document and how to protect themselves. My investment portfolio has grown substantially, with several of my technology and sustainable energy bets paying off extraordinarily well. The blog I started has evolved into a small online community where women share advice, support, and strategies for financial independence and post-divorce recovery. My relationship with David is healthy and equal in ways my marriage to Robert never was, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than ego and convenience. The Bellevue house, once a symbol of everything Robert and I had built together, has been completely transformed into something that belongs entirely to me. Every room tells a different part of my story: the office where I manage investments and work on consulting cases, the art studio where I paint, the library filled with financial books and novels I never had time to read during my marriage, the guest room that hosts women from the consulting practice when they need a safe space to stay during difficult divorce proceedings. The water views are still spectacular, but now when I look out at Puget Sound, I see possibility rather than the reflection of someone else's dreams. If you found value in this story about fighting back against injustice and rebuilding after betrayal, please subscribe to the channel. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these important real-life experiences, and we're so close to reaching our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Click that subscribe button now and join our community of people committed to resilience, justice, and personal growth. Every subscription matters and helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages. Last year, on the 5-year anniversary of the trial, Margaret and I and Dr. Lindstrom got together for dinner at a restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay. We toasted to justice delayed but ultimately delivered, to friendships forged in the fires of legal battle, to all the women we'd helped in the years since my case became public. It was a bittersweet celebration, because we all acknowledged that the system shouldn't require that level of documentation and evidence and expert testimony just to prove something as straightforward as my financial contribution to a business I'd helped build. The fact that I'd needed to catch Robert and Judge Harrington in explicit corruption to win what should have been a straightforward division of assets spoke to how stacked the deck still is against women in these situations. But we also celebrated the wins, the reforms, the precedents that made the next cases a little easier. We celebrated the women who'd reached out to us after seeing news coverage of my case. Women who'd been documenting their own contributions and refusing to be written out of their own stories. We celebrated the law students who'd told me my story, inspired them to specialize in family law and fight for fairer treatment of women in divorce proceedings. Change happens slowly, incrementally, through individual battles that gradually shift the larger culture. My case was one tiny piece of that larger movement, and that mattered even when the personal cost had been so high. The question I get asked most often, both by women in similar situations and by people who've read about my case, is whether I'd do it all again knowing what I know now. Would I still marry Robert? Still put my grandmother's inheritance into his business? Still spend 17 years building something with a partner who would ultimately betray me so completely? It's a complicated question, because the answer is both yes and no. No. I wouldn't choose the betrayal and pain and humiliation if I could simply opt out of those experiences. But yes, I'd choose the journey because it made me who I am now. Stronger, wiser, more certain of my own worth, and less willing to accept less than I deserve. The version of me that walked into Judge Harrington's courtroom that first morning was still, in some ways, seeking external validation for contributions I should have already known were valuable. She needed the judge to acknowledge her worth, needed Robert to admit his lies, needed the system to validate her narrative. The version of me that exists today knows her worth independent of anyone else's acknowledgement. I fought for fair treatment in that courtroom not because I needed Robert or the judge or anyone else to tell me I was valuable, but because allowing injustice to stand unchallenged would have made me complicit in my own erasure. That distinction matters, and it came from everything I endured and overcame during those years of legal battle. I also get asked frequently whether I've forgiven Robert, and the honest answer is that I don't think about it in those terms anymore. Forgiveness implies a kind of active process, a conscious choice to release resentment and anger toward someone who wronged you. What I've experienced is more like moving beyond the point where his actions have emotional power over me. I don't forgive him in the sense of saying what he did was okay or excusable, but I also don't carry active hatred or anger. He's become increasingly irrelevant to my emotional life, a person who was once significant, but who now exists only as a historical figure in my personal narrative. Whether that constitutes forgiveness or something else entirely, I'm not sure it matters. Please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. These stories of resilience and justice matter, and your subscription helps us share them with more people who need to hear about others who face similar challenges and overcome them. We're building toward our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and every single subscription gets us closer to that milestone. Click that subscribe button and be part of this growing community, dedicated to supporting each other through difficult times and celebrating victories over injustice. The impact of the case extended beyond just the legal reforms and the women we've helped directly through consulting. Several journalists have written about the case over the years, examining it from different angles: the corruption aspect, the gender dynamics, the financial complexity, the eventual justice. Each article brings new people reaching out with their own stories, their own struggles with being written out of narratives they helped create. Some are divorce-related, but others are about business partnerships gone wrong, family members claiming credit for shared work, professional situations where contributions get minimized or erased. The specific circumstances vary, but the underlying dynamic is familiar. Someone trying to steal credit, rewrite history, and profit from another person's work, while denying that person's essential role. What I tell everyone who reaches out is that documentation is power, but so is the willingness to use it. I could have kept those emails I found hidden away. Could have negotiated a quiet settlement that gave me some fraction of what I deserved in exchange for not making waves or embarrassing powerful people. Instead, I chose to bring everything into the light, to expose the corruption and fraud, even though doing so meant more public humiliation and scrutiny. That choice wasn't easy, and it's not always the right choice for everyone depending on their specific circumstances. But for me, in that moment, it was necessary. The only way to stop people like Robert and Judge Harrington from doing to others what they tried to do to me was to make sure their actions had real severe consequences. David sometimes asks if I ever wonder how things might have been different if I'd discovered the emails earlier, if I could have prevented some of the damage by exposing Robert's plans before they were fully executed. The answer is yes. I think about it occasionally, but I try not to dwell on it. Alternate histories are interesting thought experiments, but ultimately pointless exercises. What happened, happened. And while I might have made different choices with more information at different points, I can only work with the reality I actually experienced, rather than hypothetical scenarios where things played out differently. The version of me that exists now was forged through that specific sequence of events, and I'm not sure I'd trade who I've become for an easier path. The relationship I have now with my own financial work is healthier than it was during my marriage. When I was with Robert, my worth felt tied to the success of the investments I recommended, to whether the strategies I developed paid off, to proving over and over that I deserved to be taken seriously. Now, I engage in financial analysis and investment strategy because I genuinely enjoy it, because it's intellectually stimulating and creatively satisfying. Some investments work out spectacularly well, others fail completely, but my sense of self-worth isn't riding on each outcome. The work itself is the reward, and the financial returns are just a pleasant consequence rather than the entire point. I've also become more selective about who I allow into my life and on what terms. Before the divorce, I accepted friendships and professional relationships with people who didn't particularly value or respect me, operating under some assumption that I needed to be agreeable and accommodating to maintain connections. Now, I have clear boundaries about what I will and won't tolerate, and I'm comfortable letting relationships end when they become one-sided or diminishing. It's not about being difficult or demanding, but rather about respecting myself enough to insist that others do the same. The people who remain in my life are there because they genuinely appreciate who I am, not because I've made myself useful or convenient to them. If this story has moved you or taught you something valuable about standing up for yourself and fighting for justice, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're working toward our goal of 1,000 subscribers, and your support makes a real difference in helping us continue to share these important real-life experiences. Just click that subscribe button below and join our community of people committed to resilience, growth, and supporting each other through challenging times. Thank you for being here and for listening to my story. The Morrison case, as it came to be known in legal circles, has taken on a life of its own, beyond my personal experience of it. It appears in law school curricula, in continuing legal education seminars, in articles about judicial ethics and divorce law reform. Sometimes I forget that, to most people who know about it, it's just an interesting case study with dramatic facts and important legal implications. For me, it will always be that terrible, transformative period where my entire life was on trial, and I had to fight for the right to claim my own history. Both perspectives are valid, both are true, but they're fundamentally different ways of understanding the same events. When I speak about the case publicly, I try to bridge that gap, to make the human cost visible without drowning out the legal significance. People need to understand that behind every case about marital asset division, there are real people whose identities and futures hang in the balance. Legal precedents matter, reforms matter, systemic improvements matter, but so do the individual lives shaped by how those legal processes play out. My victory mattered not just because it established useful precedent or led to helpful reforms, but because it validated my worth and contribution after a sustained campaign to deny both. The personal and the systemic are intertwined, each giving meaning and weight to the other. Looking forward, I'm hopeful that the work Margaret and I and others are doing will make these battles easier for future generations. I'm hopeful that cultural attitudes continue shifting away from assumptions that financial contribution in a marriage naturally belongs primarily to the husband. I'm hopeful that more judges will receive training about recognizing and countering their own biases, that more lawyers will commit to genuine justice rather than winning at any cost, that more women will document their contributions and refuse to be written out of their own stories. Change is slow, frustratingly slow, but it does happen when people commit to making it happen. The 5 words I spoke in that courtroom, check the offshore accounts, Your Honor, have become something of a catchphrase in my consulting work. When women tell me they're afraid to confront powerful husbands or doubt they can win against rigged systems, I remind them of those 5 words and what they represented. Not just the specific evidence I'd found, though that mattered enormously, but the willingness to speak truth to power, even when everything seemed stacked against me. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon you have is simply refusing to accept the story someone else is trying to write about you, and insisting on telling your own truth instead. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've made it all the way through, I hope you'll subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your support means everything as we continue building this community where people can share their experiences of fighting for justice and rebuilding after betrayal. Click that subscribe button now, and know that you're part of something meaningful. We're all in this together, supporting each other through the challenges and celebrating the victories, and I'm grateful for every single person who chooses to be part of this journey with us.